It sounds like a few folks have started companies, but a lot of people are maybe just thinking about starting companies. So I'm going to talk to you today about sort of the business fundamentals that you need to sort of think about as you're starting a life sciences company. So a little bit about me. I am all things passionate about healthcare. So I am a startup founder myself. I have a university spin out that I created out of Oregon State University that's focused in surgical outcomes prediction. So it's an AI ML software as a medical device company. I'm also trained as a scientist and engineer. So I was a basic scientist first. So I was trained as a molecular biologist. So I was in the lab, I was doing cell culture, all of those things. And then I went back to grad school and actually got training as a bioengineer. So I have both a scientific and an engineering background. I am a proud mom. My kid is also an entrepreneur. So she just quit her day job. She started a puzzle company. And so it must run in the family, I believe. And I'm also a venture capitalist. So I'm managing director at Suncoast Ventures. We are a venture firm that focuses on startups in the healthcare space broadly. So most of the companies that we work with are pretty much everything with the exception of therapeutics. So I wear a lot of different hats, as I mentioned. My Suncoast Ventures hat, which is a venture firm, and we look at and evaluate working with startups and writing checks. Spine by Design, which is my startup that I mentioned before, and then I've done work in the consulting space, working with lots of early stage startups around strategy and just sort of thinking through the process, especially as it relates to creating a business, and then also the process of fundraising and garnering funds as well. So the first thing that I want to just call out is that whenever you are thinking about going into the startup world, especially if you come from the scientific and technical engineering landscape, you are going to have to learn this whole new language as it relates to startups. And so I've thrown up a few of the words that you're going to get heard thrown around as you go through any kind of pitch competition or any kind of funding terms. These are things that are probably outside your comfort zone, but I just want to assure you that absolutely these are things that you can learn, that you can understand, and that you can master, especially for many of you on the call here who have done much more scientific and technical mastering of terms and understanding. So it's just really more that it's out of the comfort zone, and I 100% understand coming from being a scientist and engineer first, going into venture. These were all things that I had to come to understand. And so I want to speak a little bit today about the business fundamentals of creating any business, but in particular, it often is a step that kind of gets missed in the technical field, and that is, who is your customer? And so from that perspective, I just want to back up just a moment and say that, for example, when you are creating a new scientific or technical discovery in the lab, it isn't necessarily always clear exactly who your customer is. You may just be very excited about the scientific and technical breakthrough, understand that there's probably an application out there, and that maybe you have an interest in creating a startup or creating a business around that. But it's probably, again, outside the comfort zone to really think about some of the early stage things that are really important and critical for the business. And the first is, who is your customer? And by that I mean, what problem are you solving, and who is likely to pay you money for that problem? And this is really something that is critical to any business, but it often, as I mentioned before, in scientific and technical and often in life sciences startups, it's not something that is easily fleshed out. So I know most of you don't currently have a startup, or you maybe are working on a startup. I see a few in the chat. But basically, this is one of the biggest things that you're going to have to wrap your head around. And in the world of healthcare, it's often very complicated. For example, if you were creating a medical device, it might be that the medical device, the actual customer could be the hospital C-suite. So that could be the person that is making the decision about whether or not that hospital actually buys your medical device from your company or from a competitor, if that exists. But it's also possible that, for example, if it's something that's implantable and a surgeon is involved, that the surgeon may have some influence, or they may be the actual customer or decision maker. It depends on the nature of what that is. But in the end, it also may be that the customer may have some influence around that. For example, if it's some kind of joint replacement, it might be that a customer may have a say, and they may go online and do research, and they may think, okay, I really like the success rate of this particular device. That's a little bit less common, but actually becoming more and more common as consumers start to treat healthcare like any other business. But all of the other folks that are around this, for example, it may not, it's more than likely that the insurance company is actually the payer, or the person that is paying the money for that particular medical device. And so it becomes a very complicated landscape. And one of the first things that investors are going to want to see or understand is, for example, who is that customer? What is that pain point or that problem that you are solving related to that customer? And why is it that you are the best team to do that? And so that's something that is super important in very early on, thinking through and really understanding that. And as a part of that, there are programs, and I know ULP promotes some of these things, but there are programs, for example, like iCore, which is run out of NSF, where they essentially help you as a scientific or technical person really dive in and do something called customer discovery, which is really just a fancy way of saying asking questions and really understanding, for example, what it is that you think is going on with your customers. And that's super important at very early stages in your business, because you want to understand how complicated your go-to-market strategy will be, who has influence over whether or not they choose your solution or your product. And that's going to be in the life sciences more often than not pretty complicated, and but also a very important thing to get nailed down. So you've probably heard of something called product market fit if you've been doing stuff around business. So I just want to talk a little bit more about this. And this is something that typically in, for example, consumer products goods companies, or even in B2B SaaS companies, which often get venture funding, one of the ways in which people figure out whether you have product market fit is that they see that you have sales and that customers are buying these things. That's a great way to determine product market fit for a company that, for example, doesn't need a lot of money to sort of develop a software product or a consumer products goods product, and they can start going out and selling. For healthcare, for life sciences, for anyone in deep tech, it becomes a bigger problem, because often you're going to need to prove to folks that you have product market fit even before you have sales. And so that becomes, how do you think about that and how do you understand that? And again, sometimes it goes back to what I was speaking about before, which is just that you're going out and doing some customer discovery and really understanding who would be interested in having your product, who would be interested in buying your product, and whether or not you have enough proof points there. When you're talking about the life sciences space in particular, and it depends on what kind of market you're selling into. For example, maybe you have a product or a service that you might be selling into pharmaceutical companies, in which case, if you have a big name pharmaceutical company that you have a product pilot with, or you're doing research collaboration, investors can kind of see that as a proof point of a product market fit, for example. Or same is true for hospitals. If those are your end customer, often having a big name hospital. So within healthcare, obviously having somebody like the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic as a customer can also give you a certain amount of credibility, even if you don't necessarily have a lot of any paying customers or a lot of other customers. So from this perspective, what you're really looking at is the thing that I'm creating something that people would buy? And so understanding, again, what motivates them in order to use your technology, understanding the mind of the customer, and really understanding whether the thing that you are creating actually fits the market. And so you know, the interesting part about this is, for example, something like so Netflix, or the technology that, you know, Netflix uses now to do the streaming videos, was actually created, the concept and was created much earlier than Netflix. Part of the problem there was there wasn't a product market fit, partially because the streaming capabilities weren't there in order to be able for consumers to actually say, yeah, I'm going to pay money in order to have that streaming. But if the streaming was too slow for them, they didn't see the value. They would rather just, for example, rent. This is back in the days when people still rented DVDs. And I did find a red box the other day and realized that that still exists. But I'm dating myself when I say things like I used to go into Blockbuster and rent DVDs there. But basically what it comes down to is sometimes there's aspects of timing. Sometimes there's aspects of what the competition is. And so really understanding the sort of full background around that is important. And so it's one of the biggest concepts that you're going to be trying to prove to investors, that you have these early signals of this, of what we call product market fit. And so in relationship to that, what we look at when, and you may be familiar with this, this comes from, I did not invent this, this comes from lean launch concepts. And so I don't know if anybody has looked at any kind of lean launch education or done any kind of work in that space. But really, as I was speaking about before, when we were talking about some of the concepts of, you know, understanding and identifying what problem it is that you're solving, and then also understanding product market fit and sort of like who is the customer really willing to pay for or interested in the thing that you're trying to bring to market. It's even much more complicated than that, for example. And I'm going to give you an example using my own startup because it's an easy one for me to give to you. So my startup Spine by Design was started when I had a conversation with my co-founder about the research that she was doing at Oregon State University. And it went something like this. She told me that she was doing research and that she had created a machine learning algorithm that could predict surgical outcomes for a certain type of spine surgery called a microdiscectomy. And in those cases, it's a minimally invasive surgery, but the problem is that about 10 to 15% of the people who have it end up reherniating, and then they end up having to have revision surgeries or potentially going on to have a fusion. And if you could predict beforehand who was going to have those reherniation events, you might be able to better direct the care. And she was telling me all this, and I was like, that's really cool. And then she said, but one of the things that I've been doing is I've been having these surgeons or their graduate students or medical students draw, you know, sort of almost hand drawing and garnering the information related to the spine and the visuals from the imaging of the spine. They're doing all these things by hand, and it worked great when I was doing it at one institution. But as soon as I started adding additional institutions, the difference in how the people at one place are measuring versus someone else is too different. So it's not working the same. And so what she told me was, hey, I think my next project, I'm going to create a computer vision application where I'm going to be the one taking in the data and eliminating that user side of it, and then plugging in that information into my algorithm, in which case I'll have it more standardized. And at that point, I actually looked at her and I said, I think that might be a thing. And that's probably how many of you started your own ideas around thinking about starting a company. And what we did, and this is available in lots of different places, depending on where you are. If you're a researcher and you're at an academic institution, there's often typically some kind of program on campus that may help you figure out some of these early stage processes. We were lucky enough at Oregon State that they had an accelerator. And what we did is we went through and sort of did some of a mini version of what is in this slide, in which we tried to figure out, well, you know, how could we charge money for something like this? Who would buy this? Who would care about it? Is it the surgeons? Is it the hospitals? Is it the patients? And so we had to create a very complicated map around that. And in the end, we realized that while the surgeons and the patients might care about this because they want to direct the care, it's ultimately going to be the insurance companies and the hospital or the providers that care more, because they're the ones that are getting dinged, for example, and having to pay for a second surgery out of pocket without getting reimbursed if you're a hospital system, or if it happens after, for example, the 90-day window in which the reimbursement, which the hospital won't get dinged, an insurance company is going to pay twice. And so you can see it very quickly becomes very complicated thinking about exactly who is your customer, who is going to pay for it, how would you be able to convince somebody that it's important enough for them to pay for it. And so thinking through all of these different things related to what really is your value proposition. In this case, the value proposition is the cost savings for both the insurance companies and the providers that they will have by avoiding these revision surgeries and having to pay for those things. So that's just one example. I kind of wanted to walk you through an example. I would love to, at the end of this, have conversations or questions, or even in the middle, if you want to pipe up about your specific startup or your specific business idea, because I always love talking about early stage companies and conversations. So I want to talk to you a little bit about something that someone had a question for me earlier this week about a particular startup that has probably been in the news, and that is, one of those things that those of us that are in the life sciences especially are very familiar with, and that was the Theranos debacle and sort of what happened there. And we were having a conversation, and one of the things that I really brought up was, most people don't really understand how important storytelling is and how important marketing or just repeating, things as it relates to going out on the fundraising trail or creating a business or creating a concept around a business. And so I want to talk a little bit about storytelling, because it's probably one of the things that you're going to need the most if you're going into startup world. And it's something that maybe folks are not necessarily talking to you about. And so actually good stories evoke emotion, and we tend to make emotional decisions as humans and then back them up with data. And this is actually very true also for even venture capital. And so we can talk a little bit more about that, but this is something that is very important. So let's see where we go. So I actually listen to stories every day as a part of my job. So I get to help fund startups, to help them build companies, and I get to work with these smart-driven founders. I get to use my scientific and technical training to sort of understand the tech story as it relates to a company. And storytelling is a big part of my job. So helping founders tell their story, but also pitching and fundraising myself. These are things that I have to do. And it's an important skill set for any entrepreneur to have. But it's often a lot like this diagram, which is, here is all of the science and things that went into what it is that you're working on. Now, how do I distill out all of these things that I have inside my head, or that you have inside your head, or that your team has inside their head as it relates, and figure out what are the things that are important to your story? And this is where I'm going to give you some insight about what investors care about. And so the reason that I started this whole conversation with thinking about the problem and thinking about the business model and thinking about product market fit is because these are all things that investors care about, and they're all things that you need to start building around your startup outside of, for example, the IP story or the technology story. You're going to need to start building those within your business. They care about, do you fit their thesis? So I can't tell you how many times I get fintech startup founders reaching out to me, asking me if they can share their startup with me. I kindly respond to them and just let them know that I'm a healthcare investor and that I only work in healthcare, and I wouldn't have the foggiest idea how to evaluate their fintech startup. And so outside of the realm of some of the basics, I wouldn't really know enough about that market to be an effective investor. And so understanding their investment thesis is important. For example, are they, if you're in the pre-seed stage, do they fund companies in that stage, or are they a later stage investor? They care about who you are and what is your why. And I think this is one of the most exciting things about being a healthcare or life sciences investor is that many of the founders that I work with have super compelling stories about why they decided to start their business and what it is that they are doing. And investors actually do care about that because let's be honest, doing a startup is not easy. It's definitely, you're definitely going to run into bumps along the way. And so being able to sort of ground yourself in why you're doing it is important. And investors do care about that. They also care about if you have the team that can pull off the vision that you might have. So maybe you can effectively tell the story, but they're going to look at it and they're going to say, is this really the team that can pull that off? Are they missing something? And if you are missing something, it's not the end of the world, but being able to be self-aware enough to say, hey, I really know I need, for example, an operations person. It's in my plan. This is something as we raise our next round, we plan to bring somebody on, or et cetera. And so it's important to sort of have that concept around the team. They also care about your coachability, your personality, your tenacity. We have a no jerks policy at Suncoast. And the reality is that you know, getting involved with a startup as an investor or with you as a startup getting involved with an investor is really a lot like dating, you know, sort of like the analogy around dating and sort of marriage, which is that when these people are in your cap table, they can cause you a whole lot of heartache if it's not the right fit related to your personality and how they think about investing. And so that's something that's super important. But investors also really do care about whether or not they actually like the startup founder oftentimes, because again, you may be going through hard times with that founder. They may need you as their investor to step up to the plate and help with more than just writing a check. And so they care about that. Again, they care about the product market fit. And you're going to hear a lot more about that. And also, is the market big enough, from my colleague, Erin Call, who's going to come in and talk a lot more about the market and how you understand the market. He is an expert in that. And he's going to be speaking, I believe it's next week is his session. And so I'm not going to really go much into that, but I just wanted to give a plug and a shout out. He has a consulting company that's been doing this with hundreds and hundreds of life sciences and med tech companies. And so it's definitely something that you should come back if you have a startup and you're interested in learning more about that. And then lastly, and I think this is something that I laugh because sometimes, depending on how sophisticated the founder is or how much they know about venture backable startups, for example, one of the things that they may be missing is how investors really care about how will they make their money back. And there's really only two ways for them to make their money back. One is if your company is acquired, and the other is if your company IPOs on the stock market. And so you as a founder, as you start thinking about whether you're going to be a venture-backed company, need to understand that they are expecting you to exit your company in a pretty decent time frame within the time that you start on the venture track. And so typically that's less than 10 years. There may be some deep tech and science companies that may have a little bit longer horizon than that, but for the most part, that's a typical expectation. And really, the sweet spot is they typically want to know that you have an opportunity to exit within 5 to 7 years. So that's something that they're going to be looking for. So when it comes to pitch content, and again, you're going to have, I think, opportunities for one-on-one pitch coaching as a part of Pitch Launch Grow, is my understanding, but there are, for those of you that are interested in that. But I just want to kind of give you like a high level conversation about what should go in the pitch deck. And it's funny because I don't even know how many pitches I've seen. I know it's probably approaching close to maybe 500 at this point, where essentially we as investors are looking for certain kinds of information, and we're also looking to be entertained. We don't want to tune out. We want to be engaged. And that's why you start with that problem that I mentioned before and framing it as a really big problem. And if you can connect any kind of emotional connection to that problem, that's even really helpful, because investors are humans too. They have emotions. And if they can feel the pain, even just temporarily, of the problem that you're speaking to, that can engage them. You want to talk about your solution and why your solution is the answer to that problem. You're going to talk about the market opportunity. And again, you're going to hear more about how you sort of dig into and understand what that is next week. And you also want to talk a little bit about the competition. And in particular, no investor wants to hear that there's no competition, because two things happen there. There's no competition because there's no viable business way to make money at what it is that you're doing, or there's no competition because it's a product that's going to have a lot of customer education for these customers to understand what your thing is. Or the truth is, typically there is competition. It's just not maybe direct competition, or it doesn't look exactly like your product, and you as a startup founder are not aware of it. And that's always a red flag for an investor. They really want to understand your go-to-market strategy. And they also understand that your go-to-market strategy may change, pivot, look different, especially if you're a really early stage founder. So they don't expect that you have everything buttoned up, but they really do they expect that you have thought about these things. And in life sciences or in healthcare, sometimes this involves things like, is there a regulatory pathway that's involved in this? And what does that look like? Is there, do you have IP secured? And is your IP enough to sort of create a competitive advantage or make you a great target for acquisition? They want to understand, for example, is your product going to need to be reimbursed in order to be able to be paid for? And does that matter? Sometimes in life sciences, you have people that are going direct to consumer. And what does that look like? And are people willing to pay for that? They want to understand your financial forecast. And by this, I mean, they want to look at, how are you going to make money? And what does that look like over time? And how long are your sales cycles? They care about that. And in healthcare in particular, sales cycles can be very long, and deals could be potentially lucrative, but it may take you 12 months to a year to get a particular customer on board. And what does that look like? And so they care about that. I get a lot of questions from founders about the hockey stick slide, and they get very sheepish, and they recognize that they've done all their numbers and they believe all the things that they have in there, but it makes them feel uncomfortable because there's so much unknown. And I just want to reassure you that we as investors 100% know that. We also know that if you have a hockey stick slide in which your growth is too slow and too low over time, that's going to raise a red flag, as well as if it's like ridiculous and crazy, and we think, oh, there's no way they're going to do that. And also, why does this founder think that they are going to do what, you know, most successful startups don't? And that's a red flag again. But for the most part, if you have a reasonable financial forecast that's backed up by your go-to-market strategy and all of these other things, that's really what they're looking for. Is the market big enough? Is there an opportunity for you to make enough money for you to become, you know, a good exit for them? They care about your team and your advisors. They care about your asks. Sometimes when people are pitching, they're not even necessarily have an open round. They might be pitching, for example, for strategic partners, or they may be pitching to try to attract the right team member to their team. And then the pitch content that I think sometimes founders forget is, you know, they say, how on earth, for example, if they're trying to do a 5-minute pitch, if they're doing some kind of competition, or if they feel like they need a 10-minute pitch as something when they're out fundraising, they should have backup slides for especially the common questions that you're expecting to get, but that allows you to pull up visuals or data that can help back up, for example, maybe you have your pro forma in your financial forecast, and if you don't know what pro forma is, the good thing to note is that Genevieve Lemarchal, the general partner of and managing partner of Suncoast, will be coming and talking about that at the end. So she's going to be talking all things cap table and pro forma and all of the financial side of things. So that'll be the final, I believe, the final session in this 4-part series. But having those backup slides to pull up when investors start asking questions. And by the way, if an investor is only nodding and smiling during your pitch, Usually that's trouble. I know that in other places that might signal that they're getting what you're saying, but if an investor starts interrupting you and asking pointed questions during your pitch, that's actually a really good sign that they care and that they're interested and they want to learn more. So it's kind of counterintuitive to maybe how someone's got their hand raised. Did you have a question? Hold on, let me see. Do you want to type it in the chat, or you want to just come on to, if you have somebody had their hand raised, I'm happy to
Yeah, I
answer a
raised
question.
my hand.
Yeah.
I didn't know what you meant by a hockey stick slide.
Yeah. I don't have that in my backup slide, but I will pull one up for you at the end of this. So it's really the slide that says, for example, in year one, we're going to make $100,000. Maybe just throw this out there. In year two, we think we might make $500,000, for example. And maybe in year three, we think we're going to make 1.5 million, and so on and so forth. So it's that concept of the curve, or essentially the hockey stick, that shows that year over year, you're going to continue to grow. Does that make sense? It's basically like a bar graph typically that shows your anticipated revenue from your startup that is going to continue to grow year after year. And what most investors are looking for is that it's going to probably start flat like the bottom of a hockey stick, and then it's going to go up exponentially. And so the whole concept of the hockey stick slide is just really that they want to see that you're going to have that explosion in growth.
Thank
Did
you.
that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in. I appreciate that. And I recognize that I may be, like I said, like when I showed that first slide with all these new terminologies out there, like that I may be throwing out things that are super familiar to me, but that may, so please jump in, ask questions. I really appreciate that. I'm happy to back up and define something. And I wanted to talk about what those key pitch traits that I and other investors are looking for when we are talking to startups and founders. We really do care about the story and the why, right? And like, how did this company get started? And, one of the startups that we work with, the founder has an African-American daughter, and he also had a father that had a medical mistake, and he realized how much how much was happening within the world of clinical trials related to the lack of diversity as it relates there. And so he became involved with a clinician that had a mission around that and worked with him at a previous company. And then they spun out and created their own company. And he's continuing to work on that. And it's something that drives him. It's a passion for him. And so understanding and knowing that story makes a difference. Another founder that we have worked with had 2 premature babies, and one of them passed. And part of the reason why he believes that happens is that he didn't have the right kind of clinical information to make informed decisions as a parent. And he is on a mission to change that for other parents and also for other patients and families of other kinds of conditions. But they've started in the NICU with a product that helps translate clinical information into something that parents can understand. And so again, these are like really, really powerful stories. And I have to tell you that in particular, that second startup in the beginning probably got founded against all odds, or funded against all odds of what kind of proof points they actually had as a business, because investors resonated and understood the powerful of that. So yeah, so somebody is asking if there is a great so there is a book called Venture Deals. And I highly recommend, if you're a startup and you're interested in learning more about that, I think that's one place that you can go. And I know for a fact that ULP has a lot of great resources on their website as well. And I might defer to Emily to help point you in the direction related to that. But I believe that Venture Deals is a great place for people to to start, like from a terminology perspective. And it helps you understand this whole concept of like, what is a round and what is a cap table and what is a valuation and when does that come in and all of those things, which is, you know, it takes a long time to really understand these things. And I'm still learning every single day. I did not come from this background. I came from a very different background. And so there's lots of nuances as it relates to startups and fundraising. One of the things that we're looking for from founders is passion and integrity. So we want to see that if you're not excited about your if you're not excited about your startup, if you don't have passion for this, it's going to be hard for the investor to have passion for it. They want to know that you have integrity. It's going to be a huge thing for them. I mean, you guys have all seen the news and all of the startup founders that didn't have integrity and bilked investors and things, and nobody wants to be that investor that invests in somebody that like that. Knowledge and humility. So they expect you to be an expert or the person that has a lot of understanding, but it's also okay to admit the certain things that you may or may not know, and also take feedback or insight from investors as well. And so there's sort of like a fine line there in terms of and this has to do with like coachability and whether or not they see you as somebody who they could work with. And because a lot of times investors really want to be engaged with startups on a broader level, especially very early stage investors. They're also looking for confidence and focus. So confidence is going to come through in you sharing your business. They're going to feel it if you're not confident, and it's going to take a while for you to practice pitching and to get used to that. And you might be super confident, for example, giving a scientific or technical presentation at your annual meeting that you normally go to as a scientist or an engineer, but you might be way less confident when you're pitching, asking people for money. For example, that might be really outside your comfort zone. So it's something, but it's something that I swear to you, and this is part of my reason why I believe sometimes male founders are funded at a stronger, at a higher rate. There's lots of reasons why, and it's one of those things for those of us who are women in this space. We're super frustrated at the lack of venture dollars that go into female founders, but some of that may have to do with the differences in the way we perceive confidence from founders, where males may be giving certain kinds of traits that are exuding that, even if they don't have the underlying confidence that maybe another founder does. But the other side of this, the focus, is really important. We don't want to see every single thing that you're thinking about what you might do with your startup someday. We want to see a bright line from idea to making money and exit. And if you are pinging all over the place, that's typically a very big red flag for an investor. So the focus, it's totally fine to have other R&D ideas. It's totally fine to have lots of other potential plans or customer segments or all of these things. And sometimes it's okay to mention those within a pitch. I'll give you an example of one, and then I think we're getting very close to the end of the presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. But there is a startup that I work with in Portland that is actually, she's an oral surgeon, and so she's a clinician, and she also just happened to be a trained chef and had experience with her own swallowing problems because she had a jaw that was crushed when she was younger, and that's part of what drove her passion to become a reconstructive surgeon in that space. But she started to realize that there were a lot of patients that struggled with eating food that were essentially being forced onto a puree diet, which for those of us, you know, as grown-ups, we all start with baby food, and these are people who essentially end up only being able to eat the equivalent of baby food for the rest of their lives. And it's something very sad, and it takes a lot of the joy out of eating and food, and also it creates a lot of malnutrition and other health problems. And so she went on a mission to create essentially the first fully dissolvable solid food that would be safe for people who had these kinds of medical disorders called in swallowing called dysphagia. And throughout this process, she partnered with a Food Innovation Center to get the formulation right. She's done branding, she's done all these things. And as she was sending out, she had a pediatric line for pediatric patients that had swallowing disorders. And what she found was that the non-medically challenged kids in the family actually were liking and loving the product. And then she came to understand that she had an entirely different market. Can anyone guess what the other market is for this product, for this safe swallowing solid food? So turns out that as you're coming off of baby food and you're in that toddler space, as parents, they're looking for things that their kids won't choke on, but that can give them the ability to sort of snack or eat things that are nutritious themselves. And so when she pitches as a startup founder, she has so much credibility. She has a partnership with Cleveland Clinic. She has all of these other things related to the medical side, but she also has this other huge market in direct-to-consumer kids, just in food, right? Just like on the shelf at Whole Foods or some other place like that. And so as an investor, it's okay for her to bring that up, because not only does it show that it shows that she has this whole other huge market, and it gives a lot of other but for the most part, what you're wanting to do is sort of hone in on that direct line from, you know, how I'm going to go from this idea all the way through to the end. And so that's just one example of times in which you might want to mention other markets, especially if it adds a whole new segment. And really, this is my daughter when she was, I think, 18 months old. But I love this picture, because this is what you want to feel as an investor. Like when I listen to an amazing pitch and somebody who just comes across with all these things that I mentioned, we're ready to dive in and learn more, and we want to understand everything about it, and especially if we're considering writing a check. And so that's what you want investors to feel like when they're done. And you want to leave open questions. You don't want to spew out every single thing about your startup all in that one meeting. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a data room or know what that is, but, and we're not, I mean, we could teach an entire class just about this, but basically a data room is a place where investors start going when they're considering investing in you. And could be as simple as a Google Drive. There are other softwares out there. There are other ways to do this, but essentially it's going to contain organized information that an investor wants to go dive into more in order to better understand the things about your startup. And so this is something that as you're thinking about creating a startup, and as you do have a startup and you're getting ready to go out and think about fundraising, that nobody expects you to have every single thing in here. And a data room looks very different for a pre-seed startup that's pitching to an accelerator than it does somebody that's at Series B in their fundraising journey. But it's just important to understand that this thing exists, and that it's something that you will have to have, and that it's something that investors are going to do they're going to do their own homework, but they're also going to dive in and look at what homework you've done. So what if we don't know someone personally who is struggling with a medical problem that we are trying to solve with our idea and company? How do I create a captivating story when I don't interact with the patients that I want to help with my IP and technology? First of all, it would be great if you can go out and talk to some of those folks and understand the struggles that you're having, because that will give you the grounding in that, if it's possible for you to get that. If you don't know someone who's personally struggling with the medical problem, but it's a problem that, for example, a lot of people have experienced, you don't necessarily have to have that personal. And I can give you an example. I don't think I have time to run through it, but there's a company called Nanodropper that's out of Seattle. They have a very unsexy problem. And their problem is eye drops are too big and they get wasted and they run down your face, right? And one of the very first pictures that they have is a picture of, like, we've all experienced, right? When you put eye drops in and that stuff that runs down your face. And then they also have a picture of a grandma that has like a pained look on her face, and And they draw the emotional connection to like, yeah, they ground them in this shared experience that everybody's had of like wasting eye drops down your face, which is one thing if it's Visine, right? It's a whole nother thing when it is a glaucoma medication that maybe that person is choosing between like food and medication, right? And so you just want to try to ground them in the struggles that these patients are having. But I fully encourage you to both talk to the clinicians who are treating these patients. And if you're capable of talking to the patients themselves, you may learn all kinds of things that you were not aware of before. We certainly did that with Spine by Design. When we talked to the surgeons, they would say, of course, my patients never reherniate. And then we would talk to patients and they're like, of course, I didn't go back to the surgeon that I had the original surgery with. And so like, there may be some missing pieces that are really important for your business by talking to the patients, but that's one example of ways that you can kind of ground that emotional. And really it's a numbers game, right? And going out and pitching and talking to people, you're really trying to find the people who resonate and that get you. And it's not going to be everyone. It's just like dating in that way, right? It's not, you may find a very nice investor, but that the timing isn't right for them to write you a check. Maybe if it was a different timing or you were a different, stage, or they were a different stage in their fundraising, they would potentially consider writing you a check. So just realize that it's about that. And then lastly, that once you get on this journey, you're really on it. And that is something to seriously consider, because the minute that you take outside funding, you're sort of on this trajectory that's expected to take off with growth and then ultimately exit. So what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes that life sciences startups often encounter during their fundraising journey, and how can I proactively avoid them? I think the biggest thing is trying to go out too early or trying to not. So I think one of the big things for life sciences startups is definitely take advantage of non-dilutive funding or other programs that can help you button up a lot of these things beforehand. And I think some of the other pitfalls that I see is focusing way too much on product or the technical side and not enough about how important the business side of your business is. I would highly encourage any technical founder to find a business co-founder that can be along for the ride with you. Find somebody that has business chops, but scientific and technical background, maybe somebody who's done this fundraising thing before, because I would say it's only half or maybe even less than half of the success of a startup, the technology or the thing. And I think in life sciences, especially, like, for example, like in the consumer products good space, you could have a startup that is making deodorant. Now, there are a lot of people making deodorant, and maybe they might even have IP around it. They've got special deodorant IP that means you sweat less and it's natural and all these things, right? But it ultimately still comes down to a brand play, right? And we're all familiar with that. Like, we make decisions about products that we buy, whether we buy an Apple or an Android. They're both phones, they're both smartphones. We can do many or most of the same things with those phones, but we have maybe brand loyalty for certain reasons. Within life sciences startups, that matters as well. It matters less in early days, but it does matter. But understanding that the business side of the business is super important. So the scientific and technology is one thing, and especially if you're spinning out of an institution, making sure that you're getting tech transfer correct, right? So if you're spinning out of an institution, investors are going to see that you have the freedom to operate with the IP, for example, et cetera. But the fundraising journey is really, practice, understand, and find people who are friendly that are willing to give you the kinds of feedback that are going to help move the needle forward for you. So, don't be so afraid that it has to be perfect before you go out and start talking to people is the other thing that I would say. Because the longer you stay in that bubble and you don't go out and talk to customers or potential investors or et cetera, the more that you will go down a pathway that may or may not be viable for you without getting the outside feedback. And it looks like we have about